Something is breaking inside the American labor market, and the numbers hit like a detonation. Layoffs have already blasted past 1 million plus. Companies are freezing hiring at the lowest levels in 10 years, and workers now spend an average of 24.5 weeks searching for a job that may not even exist. Corporate debt has surged above $13.7 trillion. Federal debt has crossed $38 trillion, and households are drowning under $1.23 trillion in credit card balances. The economy isn't cooling. It's convulsing. A silent shockwave is moving through every workplace, every paycheck, every household, and it's accelerating faster than anyone expected. The reason America feels unstable is simple. The economic data used to reassure the public is no longer connected to reality. For more than a year, officials have pushed the narrative of a strong labor market, pointing to headline job creation, while quietly revising those same numbers downward months later. When you examine the underlying data that cannot be easily massaged, layoff reports, unemployment duration, hiring freezes, and sector-level contractions, the picture is unmistakable. The labor market isn't cooling. It's deteriorating at a pace we haven't seen since the early 2000s. The most alarming indicator is the explosion of job cuts. Year-to-date layoffs have surged to 1.099 million, a level normally associated with recessions, not expansions. October alone saw 153,074 terminations, representing a 175% increase compared to last year. These aren't isolated events or restructuring blips. They form a synchronized pattern across every major sector. Public institutions, technology, retail, warehousing, and service-based industries are all contracting simultaneously. A genuine expansion never produces this type of uniform employment loss. Layered on top of this is the collapse in hiring momentum. The last 4 months produced the weakest hiring plans for June, July, August, and September in over a decade, signaling that companies aren't just cutting, they've stopped adding. The average monthly hiring plan number sits near 48,000, far below the healthy threshold required to absorb displaced workers. Even the headline-grabbing 283,000 hiring surge in October collapses when you subtract Amazon's temporary seasonal staffing. Without that single outlier, hiring momentum would have been the worst in 10 years. This imbalance creates a dangerous mismatch. 7.22 million job openings versus 7.42 million Americans searching for work. For the first time since the pandemic shock, there are more job seekers than jobs available. Worse, 1.93 million people have been unemployed for more than 27 weeks, and the average jobless duration has risen to 24.5 weeks. Once long-term unemployment begins climbing, it rarely reverses quickly. Historically, recovery takes years, not months. The real problem is not a lack of effort from workers, it's a structural breakdown in demand. Businesses are cutting because revenue growth is slowing, debt costs are rising, and inflation has shredded purchasing power. When companies stop expanding, the labor market loses its shock absorbers. Every subsequent layoff becomes harder to absorb, and the system begins feeding on itself. The illusion of stability disappears the moment you look at the unedited numbers, and those numbers show a labor market slipping into a deeper and more dangerous phase. Once the illusion of stability is removed, the scale of the employment breakdown becomes impossible to ignore. The United States is now experiencing a level of job destruction that aligns with deep recession behavior, not a so-called soft landing. The data from the Challenger report is unambiguous. The labor market is contracting at the fastest sustained pace since 2003, and the deterioration is accelerating month after month. The most disturbing indicator is the velocity of cuts. October's 153,074 layoffs aren't just a large number, they represent a 183% month-over-month escalation. A normal economic cycle does not generate a threefold spike in terminations within 30 days. That level of compression signals that corporate leaders are preparing for something far worse than a minor slowdown. Year-to-date cuts now stand at 1.099 million, surpassing every pre-pandemic year going back to the aftermath of the Great Recession. Even more alarming is how widespread the downsizing has become. Government entities alone have eliminated 37,000 positions, a rarity outside large fiscal crises. The technology sector, a consistent job creator for more than a decade, has slashed 141,000 roles. Warehousing removed 90,000. Retail wiped out 88,600, and service-based industries cut another 63,000. This is not isolated weakness inside a single sector. This is synchronized contraction across the backbone of the U.S. economy. The structural nature of these cuts is further confirmed by the surge in organizational downsizing announcements. October saw nearly 450 separate employers announce formal layoff plans, up from 400 the previous month. The fourth quarter is typically a period when companies avoid bad optics, yet the pace of cuts now mirrors the urgency seen during financial distress periods. Historically, this type of fourth quarter downsizing precedes full-scale recession recognition. Equally important is what these cuts represent: cost containment pressure, not efficiency gains. Companies confronting rising debt servicing, declining revenue growth, and shrinking consumer demand are eliminating workers to prevent balance sheet collapse. This is not innovation. This is triage. Taken together, these numbers reveal an economy shifting from expansion to contraction at extraordinary speed. The job market is no longer absorbing shocks. It is transmitting them downstream. And as every major sector reduces headcount simultaneously, the system loses its stabilizers, setting the stage for even more severe economic consequences. The collapse in employment isn't happening in a vacuum. A second force is accelerating the damage: the rapid, unregulated integration of artificial intelligence into core business operations. For decades, automation replaced physical labor. Today, AI is replacing cognitive labor. Administrators, analysts, coders, project coordinators, customer support teams, and back-office infrastructure that once formed the spine of American employment. And unlike previous technological transitions, this one is happening at a speed the economy cannot absorb. The October data reveals the scale of disruption. 31,000 layoffs were attributed directly to AI adoption in a single month, more than any documented month in modern U.S. labor history. Year-to-date, AI-driven cuts total 48,000, and these numbers represent only what companies publicly acknowledge. Many firms quietly reclassify these cuts as restructuring, masking the true impact of automation. The displacement is accelerating, not plateauing. Companies are deploying AI aggressively because cost-saving incentives have never been higher. With corporate debt burdens exceeding $13.7 trillion, interest expenses climbing, and margins being squeezed, replacing a $60,000 employee with a $5,000 per year. AI system is no longer a strategic decision. It's a survival reflex. This is why entire departments are being eliminated rather than downsized. Once AI begins handling the workload of 10 employees, that labor demand disappears permanently. The most concerning element is the asymmetric impact. AI is not only cutting jobs, it is preventing new ones from being created. For every role replaced, future vacancies that would normally open during expansion cycles never materialize. This suppresses hiring pipelines, depresses entry-level opportunities, and intensifies long-term unemployment. The result is a widening gap between job seekers and available roles, especially in white-collar fields once considered secure. Economists have warned that once automation outruns labor absorption, the market enters a structural inversion. That inversion is now visible in the data. The mismatch between 7.22 million job openings and 7.42 million active job seekers grows as AI erases mid-skill positions that once filled the middle of the economy. The effect compounds every month. AI was sold as a productivity revolution. In reality, it has become a labor market accelerant, multiplying the damage caused by an already contracting economy. As companies automate their way through financial stress, the shockwave cascades directly into unemployment lines, making the recent surge in job cuts not only predictable, but irreversible. The acceleration of AI-driven cuts is only one side of the crisis. The deeper pressure comes from a financial structure inside corporate America that is beginning to fail for years. Companies sustained growth through cheap borrowing, aggressive leverage, and inflated asset valuations. That system collapses the moment interest costs rise and revenue growth decelerates, exactly what is happening now. The result is not discretionary layoffs. It is forced downsizing driven by mathematical necessity. Corporate debt has surged to $13.7 trillion, and refinancing that debt now demands interest payments some firms cannot cover through current cash flow. When operating margins shrink below sustainable thresholds, the first expense that collapses is payroll. That's why large employers across government, technology, warehousing, retail, and services are eliminating tens of thousands of roles. Not because they want to innovate, but because they are fighting liquidity pressure. A major indicator of this stress is the shift in corporate priorities. Instead of funding expansion, businesses are diverting cash toward debt service, insurance, compliance, utilities, and taxes, costs that have escalated far faster than revenue. Commercial rents have risen sharply, energy remains volatile, and essential inputs for manufacturing and logistics continue to climb. Employees become the balancing mechanism in this environment because they represent a significant portion of operating expenses. Once these structural costs exceed top-line performance, layoffs are not a choice. They are a condition of survival. This pressure is intensified by declining consumer demand. With household savings drained, credit card debt surpassing $1.23 trillion, and delinquency rising across auto loans and personal loans, consumers are spending less. Lower demand reduces corporate revenue, which further compresses margins. When revenue falls while financing costs rise, downsizing spreads across sectors regardless of business model. The scale of restructuring announcements exposes the severity of this transition. Nearly 450 employers announced job cut plans in October, the highest level in over 20 years for that month. These actions typically appear in late-stage recessions, not in alleged periods of economic resilience. Companies are reducing headcount preemptively to withstand an expected contraction, signaling that internal financial forecasting is far worse than public messaging. Corporate America is not optimizing. It is bracing. Every data point reveals a system under extreme financial strain, one where payroll reduction has become the default response to deteriorating balance sheets. Combined with the accelerating influence of automation, the corporate landscape is now producing job losses faster than the economy can replace them, pushing the labor market into a deeper and more dangerous phase. As corporate balance sheets strain and automation accelerates displacement, a second and equally destructive force is emerging: the collapse of hiring. The danger is not only that companies are cutting workers, it's that they've stopped replacing them. A healthy labor market requires new job creation to offset inevitable turnover, retirements, and industry transitions. But the U.S. economy is now producing some of the weakest hiring levels in more than a decade, signaling a structural halt in employment generation. The data is unequivocal. For 4 consecutive months, June, July, August, and September, announced hiring plans hit the lowest levels recorded in 10 years. June produced barely 3,200 planned additions. July and August were not much better, and September, although appearing strong at 117,000, was actually the weakest September hiring figure in a decade. This collapse in employer confidence reveals a shift from expansion to preservation. Companies are not preparing for growth cycles, they are bracing for contraction. The most misleading figure emerged in October: 283,000 hiring announcements. At first glance, it appears to signal recovery. But nearly 250,000 of those positions came from a single company, Amazon, whose seasonal hiring artificially distorted the national picture. And even that number hides the truth. The company simultaneously laid off tens of thousands of employees and plans to cut up to 600,000 more in future cycles. When the distortions of one employer are removed, the U.S. hiring environment collapses back to decade-low levels. This breakdown has severe consequences. When hiring pipelines fail, displaced workers have nowhere to go. The economy becomes unable to absorb layoffs, and unemployment accelerates even without new shocks. This dynamic is already visible, with 7.42 million Americans actively looking for work and only 7.22 million openings, the country now faces an employment deficit. The fact that this deficit exists before an officially declared recession indicates the severity of the contraction. Hiring is the engine that keeps the labor system functional. When businesses stop creating roles, everything downstream begins to fracture. Entry-level workers lose access to career ladders. Mid-career professionals face prolonged unemployment gaps. Skill erosion accelerates. Workforce churn, the mechanism that keeps the market dynamic, freezes. And when churn freezes, the entire system becomes brittle. This collapse in hiring is not a temporary slowdown. It is the clearest warning sign that the labor market has shifted from expansion to structural decline. Combined with accelerating layoffs and automation, it marks the moment the U.S. employment ecosystem loses its ability to regenerate, pushing the country toward a far deeper labor crisis. The collapse in hiring and the acceleration of layoffs create a predictable downstream effect. Long-term unemployment begins to rise. This is one of the most dangerous indicators in any economy because once workers remain unemployed past a certain threshold, the likelihood of re-entry into the labor market declines sharply. The United States is now entering that phase, and the data shows a deterioration that no official narrative can conceal. The first warning signal is duration. The average American worker now spends 24.5 weeks unemployed, more than 5 months without income, stability, or health insurance. This metric is climbing steadily, and historically, once it begins rising, it rarely reverses quickly. The last time unemployment duration spiked, it took nearly a decade to return to normal levels. During the aftermath of the Great Recession, the peak reached 40.5 weeks, almost 10 months to secure a job. Today's trajectory is moving in the same direction, but significantly earlier in the cycle. The second warning signal is volume. 1.93 million Americans have been out of work for more than 27 weeks. This group represents 25.7% of the nation's unemployed workforce. People actively searching for employment, but unable to find it for over half a year. The speed of this increase reflects deeper structural issues: shrinking corporate demand, suppressed hiring pipelines, and the disappearance of mid-skill roles that once absorbed job seekers during downturns. A third signal is the widening gap between openings and active job seekers. Despite the government reporting 7.22 million job vacancies, the number of people searching for full-time or part-time work totals 7.42 million, creating an immediate shortfall. More people need jobs than there are positions available, and the gap is expanding. When long-term unemployment increases while the labor market simultaneously produces fewer openings, the system crosses into a self-reinforcing decline. The consequences of this shift reach far beyond individual workers. Extended joblessness erodes savings, accelerates debt defaults, reduces spending, and weakens local economies. It increases reliance on social programs at a time when governments are already facing fiscal strain. It diminishes skill relevance, making re-employment harder and wage recovery slower. Economists refer to this as scarring, damage that persists long after a recession ends. Long-term unemployment is not a lagging indicator. It is an early warning of systemic failure. The numbers now show a labor market losing mobility, losing opportunity, and losing the capacity to reintegrate its displaced workers. Combined with collapsing hiring and rising layoffs, the U.S. is not just facing temporary job loss, but the beginning of deep and lasting structural unemployment. As long-term unemployment rises and hiring pipelines collapse, the psychological damage inside the labor force becomes impossible to ignore. The crisis is no longer just economic. It is emotional, generational, and deeply destabilizing. Workers are operating under an unprecedented level of anxiety, driven by a labor system that feels unpredictable, unforgiving, and structurally hostile. The most striking trend is the normalization of constant job insecurity. Employees who are technically safe are living as though termination is imminent. When more than 1.099 million layoffs occur in under a year, uncertainty becomes a daily condition, not an exception. The fear is rational because the data shows that once displaced, workers now face an average 24.5-week search before finding new employment. That reality transforms every performance review, every email from a supervisor, every staffing change into a potential threat. At the same time, job seekers are experiencing record levels of rejection. With 7.42 million Americans actively searching for work and fewer openings available, the hiring process has turned into a bottleneck where qualified candidates are routinely filtered out. Multiple interview rounds end in silence or automated rejection, undermining confidence and creating a cycle of frustration that compounds economic uncertainty. This psychological stress has measurable consequences. Economic research consistently shows that job insecurity reduces productivity, raises burnout, weakens mental health, and suppresses long-term career development. In a competitive environment, these impacts further disadvantage workers who are already struggling to stand out in an overcrowded job market. What is emerging is a workforce emotionally strained by forces beyond its control: corporate downsizing, automation displacement, suppressed hiring, and rising unemployment duration. These pressures stack on top of rising living costs, unstable housing markets, and record consumer debt, creating a level of stress that mirrors early-stage recession behavior. The emotional collapse of the workforce is not a side effect. It is a direct symptom of a labor market losing stability. It is the human cost of an economy that is breaking beneath the surface. When 1 million workers lose their jobs in a single year, the damage doesn't stop with those individuals. It cascades through the entire economy. Every lost paycheck triggers reductions in spending, and those reductions multiply downstream. With unemployment duration rising to 24.5 weeks, households cut back on restaurants, travel, retail, repairs, subscriptions, medical services, and transportation. These spending cuts reduce revenue for small businesses already strained by higher borrowing costs and rising operating expenses. As demand falls, companies forced to protect cash flow initiate their own workforce reductions. A single round of layoffs creates secondary and tertiary waves of job losses across unrelated sectors. Economists refer to this as the multiplier effect. When enough sectors contract simultaneously, as the current data shows, this effect accelerates into a feedback loop that deepens the downturn. The ripple also reaches local governments. Lower consumer spending reduces sales tax revenue. Homeowners under financial stress delay payments, weakening property tax inflows. These shortfalls pressure school districts, city services, and state programs already facing growing operational deficits. When public institutions begin cutting staff, the contraction intensifies further. This is how recessions become unavoidable, not through one shock, but through cascading losses that reinforce each other. The U.S. labor market has already entered that phase. The labor market's breakdown is not a mystery. It is the result of structural forces that have been building for years. The United States now carries over $38 trillion in federal debt, and servicing that debt requires hundreds of billions in annual interest payments. When the government absorbs this much capital, the private sector competes for what remains, driving borrowing costs higher for businesses that already operate on thin margins. Inflation adds another layer of pressure. Even after the official rate cooled, input costs, insurance, utilities, materials, transportation, remain elevated. Companies cannot raise prices indefinitely without losing customers, so the only adjustable line item becomes labor. That's why mass cuts have aligned with rising corporate costs rather than declining profits. Layoffs are a response to structural imbalance, not temporary weakness. Local governments amplify the strain through aggressive property tax assessments used to backfill their own fiscal gaps. Higher taxes on commercial real estate push operating expenses even further beyond sustainable levels. These pressures combine with consumer weakness, delinquencies rising, credit tapped out, and savings depleted, to create an economy where both households and corporations are financially constrained. The result is a labor market squeezed from every direction. Cuts are not simply reactions. They are mathematical outcomes of a system hitting its limits. Everything now converges toward a single trajectory: a recession that the government will be forced to acknowledge only after the damage becomes undeniable the data already exposes the reality. Layoffs surpass 1.099 million, hiring sites at decade-low levels when distortions are removed. Unemployment duration is rising, and long-term joblessness has reached 1.93 million workers. These conditions traditionally appear after a recession begins. This time, they're happening before it is officially admitted. The next phase will be defined by visibility. Job losses that were once concentrated in corporate sectors will expand into public institutions, small businesses, logistics networks, manufacturing plants, and service industries tied to discretionary spending. As more companies confront higher interest payments, squeezed margins, and declining consumer demand, additional cuts become inevitable. If history is a guide, layoffs worsen dramatically in the first year of a formally recognized recession. The numbers suggest the country is moving toward that stage now. At the same time, hiring pipelines remain critically weakened. With months of decade-low hiring plans and fewer than 7.22 million real openings for 7.42 million job seekers, the labor market lacks the regenerative capacity needed to absorb displacement. When job creation stalls while job destruction accelerates, the system enters a contraction loop that feeds on itself. The question becomes not whether conditions worsen, but how deeply they cut. The combination of structural debt, high operating costs, automation displacement, and declining demand forms a pressure chamber that workers and small businesses cannot escape without systemic reform. Yet reform takes time, and the labor market is deteriorating now. Still, amidst the shock, one truth remains. People withstand crises better when informed, prepared, and united. Understanding the scale of what's happening is the first step in protecting yourself. Strengthening savings, reducing unnecessary liabilities, diversifying income streams, and building community support networks all help insulate against volatility. This is not just an economic shift. It is a turning point. The labor market is changing faster than the narrative surrounding it, and the cost of ignoring the numbers will be paid by those least protected. Staying aware, adaptive, and resilient is no longer optional. It is essential for survival in the new economic reality.